The President of the United States has announced a new 50% tax on steel and aluminum. This kind of tax is called a tariff. Canada has become too dependent on the US as its main customer. More than 90% of Canadian steel is sold to the US now. The US is using this new tax to hurt Canadian businesses. It's not just about steel. Other industries are affected too. The Canadian government says it's time to use more Canadian steel for Canadian projects. Just 1 week ago, 1 ton of US steel cost $700. Now, after the new tariff, the price has jumped to $900 per ton. This price increase was not because of the stock market. It happened because of one decision made on June 4. The president doubled the steel and aluminum tariff to 50%. Right after the announcement, steel from Canada stopped moving. Canadian steel mills stopped sending shipments to the US. The first to suffer were car factories in Detroit. Machines stopped. Robots didn't work. Workers' paychecks were delayed. In Canada, the city of Hamilton saw something different. Steel factories came back to life. The big furnaces lit up the sky like it was wartime. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said the US decision was a huge mistake. He also warned that Canada might stop selling important minerals to the US. So how did a policy made to help US factories end up hurting them? Why is Canada, a close friend of America, now treating steel like a weapon? And who is really going to feel the pain? Canada, China, or everyday Americans? On June 4, 2025, the tariff became official. It was announced early in the morning in Washington. By lunchtime, any steel arriving in the US had to pay the new 50% tax. This is double what it was back in 2018. The new tax is high enough to block many steel sellers from the US market. Soon, phones started ringing across North America. Companies quickly realized the problem. Steel that shipped at yesterday's price would lose money today. The next day, steel prices went up fast. A major steel company raised its price to $900 per ton. That's almost $150 more in just 2 weeks. This is a big problem for carmakers. One pickup truck uses about 1 ton of steel. Ford makes 1.5 million trucks a year. That means Ford has to pay $500 million more for steel this year. But things were worse in Canada. The head of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, Catherine Cobden, said US orders had disappeared. Canada normally sends 12 million tons of steel to the US every year. Now that steel is stuck. And without Canadian steel, factories in Detroit can't keep running. Prime Minister Carney repeated his warning. He said the tariff was a mistake. He also said Canada might stop sending important minerals to the US while Canada's steel plants looked for new buyers in Asia. Things were getting worse in the US. Ford's Big River Rouge factory had to stop 2 production lines. There was not enough steel to continue. Wall Street didn't like the news. The S&P 500 stock index dropped by nearly 1%. Some traders called it a Trump session teaser. Here's the irony. A tax meant to protect American jobs is now hurting the country. There is less US steel. Factories in Detroit are shutting down. And Canada now has more control over steel in North America. And this is only the beginning. In May, Ford's CEO Jim Farley warned that this tax would cost Ford $2.5 billion in 2025. Ford had to cancel its profit forecast because of the rising costs. Even earlier, in March, Reuters reported that these tariffs could raise the price of some cars made in Mexico by up to 25%. That's about $2,000 more for a midsize SUV. Car dealers across the US quickly raised prices on imported cars. From San Antonio to Seattle, prices on certain trims went up. At the same time, customers ordering new cars from the factory faced delays. But the biggest problem showed up in jobs. By April 4, Michigan's unemployment rate hit 5.4%. It became the worst in the country, 1% higher than the US average. Local experts said the main cause was the missing steel from Canada. Each Ford F-150 truck built in Dearborn uses about 1 ton of steel. At $900 per ton, Ford's River Rouge plant is spending over $100,000 every 3 minutes just on steel. Ford wants to build 1.5 million trucks this year. This could cost over $1.3 billion just for steel before paying workers or painting the trucks. U.S. politicians noticed the crisis. On July 21, senators from the Great Lakes region went to Ottawa, Canada. They asked Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to allow more steel exports to the U.S., but Carney didn't agree. Instead, he talked about keeping even more steel inside Canada. This means less steel for American factories. A tax meant to protect U.S. jobs is now hurting U.S. carmakers. Canada now controls the steel supply, and many American workers could lose their jobs. If the tariffs don't change soon, Detroit might face a crisis like the 2008 financial crash with no bailout this time. Canada's Prime Minister Carney saw Trump's new tariff as a signal to act fast. By the morning of July 16, he announced a $1 billion fund to modernize Canada's steel factories. This money will help replace old coal furnaces with cleaner electric and hydrogen furnaces across Ontario. An hour later, Canada also reduced steel imports from other countries. Now, if too much steel comes in from outside trade partners, a 50% tax will be added. This blocks cheap steel from places like Turkey or Brazil. Only steel from clean and friendly sources can come in without high taxes. Canada's steel factories are already very clean. Ontario gets 93% of its electricity from hydro and nuclear power. That makes Canadian steel greener than most of the world's steel. This helps Canada avoid future carbon taxes from the European Union in 2026. For Hamilton's biggest steel factory, ArcelorMittal Dofasco, this is great news. They are already building new clean technology. They plan to cut 5 million tons of pollution every year. And once gas prices go down, these upgrades will also make steel cheaper to produce. While Canada moves forward, Detroit is stuck. Canadian steel that used to go to the US is now going to Europe. Europe pays more for this cleaner steel, something US automakers can't match. By the time American factories restart, Canada may already be locked into long-term deals with Europe. This would leave US carmakers behind and paying even more. The big question is, how can the US compete with a neighbor that turned a tariff into a clean energy success? Alberta isn't fighting the tariff. Instead, it's avoiding it. On July 22, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario signed a new agreement. The deal says all new pipelines, roads, and rail lines must use steel made in Ontario. This new rule pushes out US steel and gives more business to Canadian factories. The American Iron and Steel Institute says Canada sent about 6.56 million tons of steel to the US last year. More than 1 million tons were special pipe called line pipe. Now, every pound of that steel is already taken. It will stay in Canada or be sent to other countries without going through US customs. Canada just made things even harder. Last week, a new trade rule cut the amount of pipe allowed from countries that don't have a trade deal. Now, they can only send half as much as last year. If they try to send more, it gets hit with a 50% tax. US energy companies felt the impact right away. Before the tariff war started, America got about 40% of its oil drilling pipes from other countries. By March 12, experts said Canada and Mexico still sent about 16% of those pipes. But the price to bring them in is expected to go up by 15% this year. This is a big problem. Small drilling companies in Texas and North Dakota can't order pipes without paying more. Pipeline companies are losing big contracts because Alberta wants pipes made only in Canada. In the Midwest, maintenance teams are taking parts from storage because new ones are stuck in customs. Big US companies don't have an easy solution. Building new pipe factories in the US takes years. Shipping oil by train is more dangerous and costs more for insurance. While the US struggles, Alberta is gaining power. They get the factory jobs and tell voters it's about energy safety. In just one rule change and one limit cut, Canada used its clean electricity advantage to take control of the pipeline business. Now US suppliers have no orders, and Detroit's factories are sitting empty. Meanwhile, Europe is getting ready to tax dirty steel. Starting January 1, 2026, the European Union will add a carbon tax on all imported steel. This tax is the same as what European factories already pay for pollution. Experts think the carbon tax will be about $89 per ton in 2026. So any steel going into Europe will be more expensive unless it's clean. Canada sees this as a big opportunity. Back on February 18, 2025, a company called Anthesis said Canada's clean energy grid makes its steel ready for this new tax rule. This means Europe will see Canadian steel as green and US steel as dirty. Trucks that used to send steel south to Michigan will now go east to Europe. They can sell at a higher price and avoid Trump's tariff at the same time. For American families, this is bad news. The Tax Foundation says these tariffs will cost the average US household $1,296 this year. That's about 1 month of grocery money gone. Car company leaders in Detroit are stuck. If they try to sell in Europe, they must pay the carbon tax and lose money. If they keep using old factories in the US, they pay a 50% import tax at home. Both choices are bad, and profits are already small after the chip shortage from COVID. But Europe offers a better option. If a steelmaker shows its pollution is below average, they don't pay the carbon tax at all. Canada's factories using clean power already meet this goal. US factories still use coal for 63% of their power. They do not qualify. So companies will choose the cheapest option, like always. Trump built a tariff wall to protect American jobs. Europe built a carbon gate that moves jobs away. And Canada just opened its own door. Now it's America's turn. Should the US go green and make clean steel? Or keep the tariffs and hope other countries wait? What do you think? 50% tariffs were supposed to protect jobs. Instead, they blocked imports and left Detroit with no steel. But Canada's steel plants are working all night. Ford is losing $2.5 billion. Michigan lost its top job rating. Congress is still arguing about who caused this. Meanwhile, Canada is quietly building clean steel mills with hydrogen and clean power. If Europe's carbon tax starts in 2026, Canadian steel will go straight to Europe tax-free. US steel will get taxed twice, once in the US and again in Europe. There's still time to make a deal, but the clock is ticking. So here's the final question. Will the US stop the tariff time bomb? Or will it wait and fall behind while the world moves on? Let us know what you think in the comments. Your voice could help decide what happens next in this global steel and tax game.